When we get to the point of recognizing that everything we experience has some reflexivity going on all the time, that it's not just a matter of we take what we have for abilities and we use that to understand, that's fine. But in the process of acting, there's change. And we have to garner our resources and experiences, not just to make the next response, but in order to the very act of trying to understand what's going on here has reflexive consequences. Now, how to ask about that?
Hello and welcome. I'm Abby. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Vernon Cronen and Claire Craddock as we take a communication perspective. Usually there is more to that sentence, but today we're really just taking a communication perspective. Today we're talking all about coordinated management of meaning. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being. At the top of the episode, you heard one of our conversation partners today, Vernon Cronen. Vernon is a co-creator of the coordinated management of meaning theory of communication. He's authored countless articles, been a longtime educator, and even a consultant along the way. You can read more about him and his work in the show notes. Our other conversation partner today is Vern's colleague, Claire Craddock. Claire graduated from UNCW, where Vern teaches, in December of 2023 with a bachelor's degree in communication studies. Since 2023, the two of them have worked to improve the dynamism within CMM theory by extending and further accounting for the aesthetic dimension, as well as the position of the observer. And that's a great introduction to today's conversation. Today is a real CMM deep dive, and I don't want you to feel put off by us getting kind of technical with some of the language we use in this conversation. I'm so excited to end our season with this episode, but don't worry, we will be back with season 4 starting in February of 2025. Yes, so we are taking the rest of the year and January off from publishing episodes so that we can really dive into getting ready for next year and start recording for next season. For you, that'll be a great opportunity to go back and listen to any episodes that you may have missed along the way. Speaking of episodes, next season we're going down to every other week episodes, so there'll be half as many conversations to keep up with, hoping that that feels a little easier for you to keep up with and also leave some space in your life to engage with CMM and the CMM Institute in other ways. Well, I won't make you wait any longer. Let's jump into this last episode with Vern and Claire. Hi, Claire. Hi, Vernon. Thanks so much for joining me for this podcast. I've been really looking forward to speaking with you both.
Thank you for having both of us on your podcast today. My name is Claire Craddock. I graduated from UNCW in 2023 with a bachelor's degree in communication studies, and I work a day job as a waitress in the service industry, and I really enjoy taking part in community service projects. And I also enjoy learning about how we use our experiences to make meaning of the world around us. And Dr. Cronen introduced me to CMM theory in the last year of my undergraduate studies.
Wonderful. That's a great place to start. Dr. Cronen, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Vernon Cronen. And if you don't like CMM theory, I'm one of the two most important people to blame for it. Barnett Pearce and I started working together, I guess it was 79? Yeah, 1979, when he came to the University of Massachusetts. And I've been working along ever since. So Pearce and I published a number of things, and I've been trying to continue my work to keep it moving and developing new ideas. But I've been at this since 79. And of course, our first big publication, that book that came out, Communication, Action, and Meaning, was 1980. And then we've been working ever since, sometimes together, sometimes with our students, sometimes with other colleagues. But it's been a great ride.
Yeah. I'm always curious to know about, when I talk to people that are in the field of communication, what got you interested in studying communication in the first place? So I'd love to hear both your answers to that. Vern, maybe you could start us off.
Yeah, for me, it's a little roundabout. I was a history major as an undergraduate. When I was in the Army, in those days, if you were male, you were going to be in the Army. And I had a nice job. I was an intelligence officer, 3rd Armored Division. And my commander, my immediate commander to whom I reported, was an absolute idiot. There's no other way to put it. And he was trying to do the briefing of the general for intelligence and just botched it, just didn't know what the hell he was doing. So at one meeting, because they'd have the senior people around the inner table and then junior officers like me in the periphery, the general told my immediate commander, disappear. I don't ever want to see you again.
Whoa.
Because he was stupid. Then he turned around and said, okay, who's going to brief me for intelligence? And kind of at random pointed at me, said, how about you? And you don't say no to a 2-star. But here's the connection to communication. There I was, one lieutenant, and everybody else in that inner table was at least a major, most of them lieutenant colonels. I figured this is going to be tricky. But somehow or other, that general knew how to manage the conversation. So I got my voice in. The higher ranking people didn't feel disrespected. And he managed this so nicely that I would come out of meetings thinking, I should be just panicked. And I feel really comfortable. What is this guy doing? There is something to this communication stuff. So I switched and originally got my doctorate in communication at University of Illinois, very much outside the kind of CMM realm. It was logical positivism. You name it, I'll measure it. Statistics. Pearce started out that way too, but ran out of, in a way, interest. With all the things going on in the world, running these little studies of cognitive dissonance and attraction and all this sort of stuff that came out of cognitive psychology wasn't telling me anything that I really wanted to know. Could do it, but for what? And that's the state I was in when Barnett came with this idea of coordinated management of meaning. And so he laid down, I think his first publication was 1976, a kind of a meta theory of no laws of communication, but flexible rules that we create in social action. And that really appealed to me. And what I wanted to do with it was make it more rigorous, to move away from meta theory to theory. And so that's the path we started to tread. And then it was all work between the two of us, but mostly with our graduate students and some of our undergraduate students.
Yeah, that's a wonderful place to start and wonderful to have all that detail. Claire, I imagine you have a slightly different story.
I do, just a little bit different. So I began my studies with an interest in IMC, what I thought was an IMC. I'm passionate about many forms of creative expression, especially photography and graphic design. So about halfway through my undergraduate studies, I took an internship with a nonprofit organization specializing in graphic design. And throughout the internship, I started to build an interest for finding out why certain or how certain messages were resonating with my audience and not necessarily the construction of the design. And then at this time is whenever I was taking part in Dr. Cronen's Coordinated Management of Meaning Theory course at UNCW.
I remember very vividly, in about the middle of the semester, Claire comes to my office and says, I won't forget this. She says, this is very interesting. Are you closer to Einstein or Niels Bohr? What kind of undergraduate asks a question like that? I'm intrigued. And I have to say, to this day, that remains a problem with CMM.
Mm.
And Gregory Bateson had said, you can't step outside the system. And of course, we talk about when we interview, bringing our own experiences to that interview. But it's not very process-like. The way in which we are changing as the interviewers or the inquirers in the very process and along with the process of interacting with clients, with interviewees, that remains a difficult kind of thing in the social sciences. But we started there and then went on to all kinds of other things.
Yeah, Claire, you remember that moment?
Yeah, I wanted to learn more about how, as a consultant or as an interviewer, how within an interview you are impacted by the answers that you get through circular questioning. And I wanted to know how this sort of reflexivity is accounted for within the traditional CMM model or just within the theory in general. And it was in this process I started to realize that a large portion of my meaning making process is based off of somatic perception. And this, to my knowledge, was not really discussed in the theory. So that is another question that I approached Dr. Cronen with. Again, I just wanted to know how we account for somatic perception in this traditional model and what that means for the interviewer and for those being interviewed.
Yeah, I don't like to take for granted that people listening are in the world of communication theory themselves. So would you explain somatic perception and what your understanding of that was?
Yeah, so it's based more on the feelings that arise in communication.
Well, would it be fair to say that what we're both talking about is embodied experience?
Hmm.
Yes, and art expresses experience. I think that's what resonated with me the most. And art, I mean, it's a universal medium for communication because it goes beyond the barriers of just traditional linguistic communication.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense to me because what you both kind of described is having an experience and that being what sparked the curiosity because maybe you don't have the language for it, but you have a kind of knowing, a kind of sense of like Vern, you talked about something is different here. This person is creating this kind of space here through their communication and it's making me feel something. And that's what makes me want to know more about it.
Yes, and that feeling that you can't, I mean, it's happening in real time right now when you can't really find the words for it.
Yeah.
We account for that within the hierarchy model and any traditional models of CMM.
Yeah, that remains an interesting question, doesn't it? To what extent do the models need to be changed and to what extent expanded from inside?
Mm.
And that's what we're trying to work out, a good answer to that question and how to do it.
For me, one way to kind of conceptualize the evolution of CMM from where it started to where we are now and where we are now into the future is you gave some good language for this, that it started as a meta theory and then you merged it into, wanted to transition into a theory. And where I feel like I enter in with my work around CMM is moving beyond theory or, rooted in a theory still, but moving into this space of it being practice and being embodied.
Yes.
And so that's kind of how I think about it. So I'd be curious to know more about, Vern, maybe you could start us off with saying a little bit about that, where we started to where we are now. And then we could go on to talk about where we're going with CMM.
Yeah, well, you introduced the crucial notion of practice and practical theory. And I have to say that in the early days of this, in the early 1980s, I was thinking very theoretically. I really was not ready to deal with the methodological issues. And then something happened. Here's what happened. the big breakthrough, presented a paper called, oh God, I'm going to get my own title wrong, but it was the one about strange loops, strange loops and charmed loops. Presented it at Orthopsychiatric Association, and then it got published. Invited to Calgary, Canada, by Carl Tom, who I think is still the director of therapy there. And we presented that strange loop material. And after the basic presentation, Carl Tom drags two folks from the audience up on stage. I mean, drag physically, got each of their hands and dragged them up the few stairs over to Pearce and to myself and says, "You four have to work together because you guys have some good theory. They've got some far better practice than you have. So you are now going to go for coffee and talk to each other," which we did. And that really made the connection to the world of practice, to working with family therapists, organizational consultants, with the Milan team of Boscolo and Shakeen, and a group in Denmark, Despook. And it took off from there. So that when I was able to publish with Peter and Susan Lang, a revised CMM model that has process in it, one of the things I tried to do with that was to make it move in time, and then to plug in to every feature of that diagram. Here are the kinds of questions that are brought to mind, all circular style questions, by these particular features of that model. So that if you're thinking about the connection, say, between an act and your anticipation of response, well, what are the good questions about anticipatory response? So that the model was deeply embedded in this notion of systemic practice. That was absolutely earth-shattering in the best sense for me when we made that connection with the systemic practitioners. And that connection still goes on.
Claire, would you want to start talking about what the work that you and Dr. Cronen are doing now and where you're hoping to take CMM?
Yeah, absolutely. After taking part in Dr. Cronen's CMM theory course at UNCW, I began working on an independent study to understand how we can address that certain reflexivity and somatic perception within CMM theory and its traditional model. Our specific goal for this study was to improve the dynamism in CMM theory by extending and further accounting for the aesthetic dimension, as well as the position of the observer. And the aesthetic dimension is very interesting to me because we can use this dimension to help identify patterns and to set the full scene for an episode. And for those who are not familiar, the aesthetic dimension of communication refers to the artistic conveyal and receival of information. So this dimension kind of accounts for the feelings related to the delivery of a message. I'll give a brief example. The aesthetic dimension of communication would account for the difference between ending a relationship via phone versus ending the relationship in person. In studying this dimension, we are attempting to understand how different forms of delivery are related to the receival of information. So, in relation to CMM and its traditional model, we are studying this dimension to better understand the relationship between modes and media. And in doing so, we are trying to account for the artistic elements of an episode that may build the response of its participants, while also developing the position of the observer. But in my studies, I have found that There is not a concrete definition for an observer because we cannot place ourselves outside of the system. You are inherently a part of that system and continuously building the responses of one another. So we can kind of call everyone a participant in the system.
Yeah, I think that'll make sense to people that have listened to other episodes of mine, because I really like to emphasize that when we're talking about communication, it's not just the words we say. It's so much more about the kind of space and what's happening between people in the relationship. And so it makes a lot of sense to dive into that and explore that a little deeper. Vern, what would you add to that?
Let me just do a little bit of background. Started with a couple of articles. I know there's a podcast that you've done with John Chetrozivos.
Yes.
And on different topics. But he and I did a couple of articles in which we did try to talk about the aesthetic dimension, but we're pretty much limited to just sort of powerful moments rather than seeing the aesthetic as a constant presence in all that we do. So I see what Claire and I are doing as an extension of that original notion that this is important, but it isn't something that happens sporadically. Oh, here's a powerful moment. That still holds, but you can't eliminate the aesthetic part of meaning. I think what happened in communication following what happened in philosophy, when it took the so-called linguistic turn, which was very good, but it was a re-examination of language, but not much of an examination of what's beyond language to embodied experience. So this has not been an easy trek, but a highly enjoyable one.
Abby, in your podcast with John Chetrozivos, I know that he discusses how we use our environment to make sense of what is going on. That was very interesting to me. And he recalls a story about seeing the deer. He's on a walk and he sees some deer. And it's in that moment that he realizes he is not just an observer of the deer, he is part of nature himself. He is coexisting and co-creating with these deer, whether you're aware of this or not, it's happening.
Yeah, I see that as being kind of the first step to buying in, or really the first step to CMM becoming an embodied practice more than just a theory, is truly believing yourself to be a participant. Because in a lot of ways, we don't think of ourselves as participant in certain contexts, but like you're both getting at, we always are. And so when you can see yourself as a participant, I think that sets the stage to start asking these kind of questions around what meaning is being made.
So the work goes on, and this is a difficult kind of perspective to move on to, but I think it's a very important one. We don't want to leave behind some of these fundamental notions like powerful moments and experience that John and I worked on, and also the notion of process. If I dare make a plug here, almost a commercial plug, for a certain kind of CMM model, I'm going to do it.
Please.
Okay. I have never liked the DAISY model.
Okay, tell me more.
It's static. It doesn't account for how one act sets the conditions for what can happen next. And that is so fundamental to the way CMM started and to any understanding of language. So that the DAISY model, it's not that it doesn't raise some interesting questions, it does, but it doesn't put those questions in motion. So that I've always preferred models that have time and reflexivity, not only between people, but in the various elements of the communication process. So that when you use a context, it's going to change the context. and the responses you get will change those contexts. I know in our 1980 book, I drew in those context markers. My fault. Unless you take those context markers as simply indications of what is momentarily ideas and experiences informing others that are constantly moving and changing. So that older model that I did with Peter and Susan Lang, it has reflexivity in that the way in which people respond to us alters those contexts for the next moment. But that's not, as Claire was saying earlier, that's not dynamic and processual enough. There's more going on in the way of change in the reflexivity among contexts than is accounted for by others' response.
That's where part of our focus in the aesthetic dimension stemmed from, looking at the aesthetic dimension as kind of a directional tool that helps us move through certain assumptions, certain feelings, and understanding how that moves us from one understanding to another. So not just how it develops our understanding.
Yeah, right. How it opens the day, how it opens possibilities for the next action, and how one action is really an acting into the future. And one of the things that we learned quickly from family therapists is the value of future questions. And then to think about every action has the potential of acting into the future. And read William James, who had this great line that every word is like an arrow pointing into the future, opening and closing possibilities. Thought, yeah, that's it.
That's it. That's a great quote.
Now the question then becomes, how do we make this into practice?
Yeah, I'd love to know more about that evolution. I want to know more about specifically this evolution of context and reflexivity in your work, how your understanding of those things is evolving.
Well, we know where it's been, trying to get rid of the kind of block, this happens, then that happens, that every act has potential for what can happen next. So we worked our way through that in the 1990s. But then and we got to the point where we could ask some pretty good questions about that. But when we get to the point of recognizing that everything we experience has some reflexivity going on all the time, that it's not just a matter of we take what we have for abilities and we use that to understand, and then that leads to possibilities for another action, all based upon evolving context, okay, and how that's acting into the future. That's fine, but in the process of acting, there's change. And we have to garner our resources and experiences, not just to make the next response, but in order to the very act of trying to understand what's going on here has reflexive consequences. Now, how to ask about that? And there are some ways to do that, although it's a bit post hoc. I mean, Claire and I were both discussing this a couple of weeks ago. How you ask a question of how, after that happened, how did you understand differently at that moment? Mm. How was your understanding then a little different than your understanding before you had this moment of engagement?
So relating that to the aesthetic dimension, it opens up the possibility to ask, how would you have received this information differently if it was presented in a different way? And I think that's integral to modern communication, because we have so many different ways to communicate with each other, and they all impact us individually in very different ways.
Now, this is something we've got to develop. I mean, family therapists certainly took us in this direction. It's an old saw by now that you can't separate meaning from modality. And that's fine. I mean, one of the old therapeutic techniques, and I've used this for interventions of other kinds, it used to be write a letter to your brother instead of having a face-to-face confrontation. The idea being if you change the modality, you're going to think differently with different modalities. Great. But we were doing that stuff when people actually wrote letters.
Right.
When's the last time you've ever written a letter?
Yeah, some new modalities to think about.
Right. So that connecting what Claire is talking about, connecting the aesthetic dimension, not only with the linguistic and the somatic, but also with the technologies of communication, is an important direction I think CMM or any sound theory of communication has got to go. We can't be complacent about that. I mean, every time now and then I catch myself saying things like, no, if you wrote a letter to, oh, no, nobody's written a letter, and God knows, I haven't either, in God knows how many years. We've done a little with that, but not nearly enough. One place you can see a starting point, the book chapter with Cassandra Vinatiero. There is one short study that touches on it, and that's all I can say. It touches on it.
I think that once we get a better understanding of this dimension and of this reflexivity, and once it is better accounted for, you can use it in so many different ways, not just to understand somebody's preferred form of communication. It helps us form a broader understanding of our communication by setting the full scene for an episode. And Dr. Cronen shared something with me recently that was so interesting. He asked his students in his CMM theory course, if this episode was portrayed in a film, what music would be playing behind it? And that, if I was a consultant, a therapist, that would really help me set the scene for this client or patient feels and what's going on in their mind.
It feels really important to have the conversation about reflexivity along with the conversation about context, along with the conversation about the aesthetic dimension, because what's really compelling to me about CMM is what you're starting to talk about. How are you using it? And what I love about reflexivity specifically is that feels very active. And so it's looking back to be looking forward. It's not just looking back. And I think that's maybe what I would add to maybe critique of the models within CMM, the, staticness that you referenced. A lot of them feel like they are designed to help you look back and understand something. You would use the serpentine to see where are the turns. You'd look at a daisy to look back and say, what was I, maybe bringing to this interaction? But the reflexivity, if you can kind of make these models more active and add that reflexivity in, Vern, exactly like you're saying, then it becomes about looking back to look forward so that you can communicate differently going forward and make new choices, having richer understandings of what went on by, like you're saying, Claire, asking questions that help us articulate, I think, different dimensions of communication that not everybody feels equipped to articulate or doesn't know to be asking questions about.
That was beautifully said.
Yeah, that says it so nicely. I've always been concerned since that old 80s book came out with getting the dynamism back into the system. One of the beginnings of that was when we made the move from context as a set of beliefs to context as stories.
Yeah.
Stories have a beginning, they have a punctuation that's a beginning, and when do we think their story is coming to an end, but not a final end? And how does the story develop? And then what fits the story and what doesn't fit the story? What can happen that will take us to the point of saying there's something wrong with this story? And I think so much of intervention, whether we're talking about families or organizations, or any sort of situation, is where we introduce something that makes it difficult to go on in the old way, that makes the story no longer quite fit, so that you have to think a bit in order to ask the question. You got to think through the story in a new way.
Mm-hmm.
And then good questions about what's in the story that makes it so difficult to do anything different if what you're doing doesn't work. So I've been very disturbed, as you can tell, with some of the efforts to go back to static models.
Mm.
I think those static models alert us to a number of things.
Right.
But to me, it looks like putting templates successively over what's really a process.
Mm-hmm.
So what Claire and I are trying to do with the aesthetic dimension, anything else we're touching here, is to make these moves within the notion of reflexivity and process, and not to let go of that. There is so much cultural pressure to do what was done years and years ago, and we thought we had passed by. There's a radio program, public radio, called, I don't know if everybody gets it, Hidden Brain. And Hidden Brain should be in the 1960s. I mean, it's old-fashioned cognitive psychology. Okay, that's for psychologists, but comm people took over a lot of that stuff. I even got, from people who I know better, a set of questions that just astounded me. Like, what can CMM tell us about finding our authentic selves? Oh, come on, we got over that stuff, that there is a thing called a self that is real.
Right.
And I'm hearing this again from people who should have joined or did join us in getting rid of this stuff. I always feel like these ideas we're talking about of aesthetics connected with process, connected with action, of moving into the future, are still fighting against ideas that fight against the cultural tide.
Yeah.
And that gets frustrating. And that really gets me thinking, what in the heck have we been doing for all these years? I mean, we started in 1979 working together, and we certainly weren't the only ones doing systemic work, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
So what in the world makes it so difficult in the culture to move beyond that?
Mm-hmm.
And is that part of what's getting in the way as we try to move this forward? And that's why I need colleagues Claire's age. I don't know that she needs colleagues my age.
I do.
I
I've
need
learned
colleagues her age.
so much from Dr. Cronen. I feel very
well. Thank you.
taking part in this study.
But I am concerned. I'm concerned of where is this all going to go.
Right.
I don't know that I'm going to be doing this in 10 years. When you find that your former students are asking you for advice on planning with their retirement, you know time is moving on.
You're right.
So time, aesthetics, reflexivity, dynamism of the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Claire, what would you add to that?
It's interesting to me because I've seen a bit of discourse about this theory, and not necessarily just discourse, but conversation about the theory on different social media platforms. And it's been similar to finding little hidden gems. I've actually connected with a few people. They're anonymous accounts, which kind of makes it more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Just asking them, how did you learn about this theory? Did you do this research on your own? What are you interested in? I've connected with some unique people specifically on TikTok, and they have a unique algorithm that will kind of recommend stuff that is relevant to your everyday life. How that algorithm works, I cannot explain it. But again, I feel lucky to have been put in contact with these people who are in similar age. They're at their early to mid 20s, so wanting to learn more about the process of how we make meaning and what that's going to look like going forward, especially with the rise of like AI, but learning how to use that as a tool in our meaning making process and to not be scared of it, so to speak. After listening to some of your podcasts, I am really interested in this point of tension that you have touched on. I'm not sure if that will ring a bell. It was in a podcast that you did with Jon Stewart.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not familiar with him, but I really enjoyed that podcast because Dr. Cronin and I, have discussed this point of tension. I have called it a bifurcation point. It means two-pronged.
Yeah.
And this resonated with me a lot when I was listening to your podcast, because that occurs in the stage of the offer and the invitation of an episode.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of encapsulates that moment when you are left to decide what to do with your interpretation of what you witness. And that is another element that we're trying to account for within the traditional model, because that a lot of the fluidity that occurs in communication can be accredited to that point, because it's when you decide to how you're going to go forward with the resources that you've been given.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. As we think about the relevance of CMM going into the future, it is going back to that language of stories, Vern. It is such a question of stories and telling a new story. And I feel like I can make this generalization, and I know it's true for me, that that's why CMM spoke to me, because it was telling me a new story, because I felt like I grew up with this very kind of like simplistic understanding of meaning in the world. And it was really modeled for me to question that. And so when I was introduced to this theory that gave me a framework to do that questioning and be reflexive about my meaning making, that was a new story. And so to me, it is about telling new stories. And Claire, like you're talking about, I think one of those new stories the world desperately needs is a new story around what it looks like to live into and to communicate into moments of tension, because I think we are so deeply afraid of things that make us uncomfortable. And there's a great discomfort that comes for a lot of people with moments of tension, if that's, like conflicting opinions or needs or wants. Relationally, specifically, I'm thinking about tension, and it shows up in a lot of different ways, is that we're not, the world is not taught CMM. Claire, I think you and I are so lucky. Like I can picture myself sitting in my intro to interpersonal communication class thinking, why is everyone not required to take this class? Everyone has to take public speaking, everyone has to take finance, whatever. Everyone should have to take this class. And we take for granted, right? Yeah, we take for granted that these are skills we'll stumble into along the way. So that's just what I'm thinking about, Claire, as you bring up that tension, which I'm glad you do, because to me, why CMM is helpful in kind of providing a response to that tension is around dialogue. Because the definition that's been told to me about what dialogue is, specifically in the world of CMM, is, holding space for your own meaning and understanding and truths and stories, while at the same time being profoundly open to others' ways of being and stories. And I think that it's almost like that could be a definition for tension. Like that is almost what tension is sometimes. And it's the definition for being in dialogue. And so it's like one response to tension is dialogue. And then CMM enters into this in terms of how do we equip people to feel confident truly being in dialogue with each other.
That is so nicely put. Culturally, we have this idea that goodness of fit is the answer.
Hmm.
Everything should fit neatly.
Yes.
And I use sometimes in class, I don't know if I used it the semester that you were in that class, Claire, but there was an old book, I think it's all the way back to the 70s, by Václavic, Paul Václavic. And it's a whole set of little vignettes of things. But one of the neat things about it is it starts with a chapter called The Benefits of Confusion.
Mm-hmm.
And often I'll do that early in class. And, well, what's good? Someone will say, that's kind of confusing. Good. What's good about confusion?
Mm.
And when people think about it a bit, I usually get really good answers. Yeah, when you're confused, you have to think. You might come up with something new. If everything just fits, nothing changes.
Mm.
But there's a real cultural problem in that. I read some things about, again, William James. He used to talk about a couple of kinds of minds, and he talked about tender-minded people and tough-minded people. And his definitions are interesting. He says, a tender-minded person can't handle dissonance, can't handle difference, can't handle moments of confusion. Everything has to be laid out and exact, and that's how it is, period. Tough-minded person can go into a situation and enjoy the problems and enjoy the differences. And kind of teaching that kind of tough-mindedness, I think a lot of what education is supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I am kind of blown away that you're bringing this up right now, because I've had an experience recently that's really brought this same idea to the forefront of my mind. I got to attend a conference recently relating systems thinking and design. And I was part of a group that was putting on a workshop, and we were using a World Cafe format. If you've ever used that before, I had never. And so this was my first participating in it. And so one of my group members the night before, as we were kind of preparing for this, used the word disorientation, saying we should expect that people will feel disoriented. And I'm so grateful that he gave me that context, because I felt disoriented. I was part of the group putting this on, but also participating, like talked about, you can't not be a participant. And I felt disoriented, and I could look around. We were kind of sitting at these small tables, and I could look around at the people at my table, and I could see them kind of looking to me, disoriented. And I felt that was a bifurcation point for me, I think, because I felt kind of like recognize my own power to affect the situation. And so, because like I was kind of in this unique situation, I was sitting at this table, but I wasn't really being like a leader at the table. I was just trying to participate, but also I'd already been introduced as part of this group that's putting it on. So there was like a weird dynamic. The metaphor that I've kind of come up with to explain what it felt like, me recognizing the power I had in that situation, is that, and perhaps it's because I had to like travel to this conference, so I'd just been on a long plane flight. You know, I've heard people say, if you are experiencing turbulence on a flight, you should look to the flight attendants, because if they're panicked, then you should also be panicked. But if they're not panicked, then you can trust them, because they kind of, have authority, they have experience, they know what's up. And so that's kind of how I felt, that I was like, I'm also feeling disoriented, but I'm going to try to convey aesthetically, even, I was like, convey this, like, I'm leaning back, I'm like not looking panicked in my face. I'm trying to convey this like relaxed, yes, this is what's supposed to be happening, to help them make sense of what they're experiencing. And so that has just like prompted a lot of curiosity in me about the moment of disorientation that, Vern, exactly like you're saying, we have such a strong story. Talk about needing a new story. We have such a strong story about that, feeling a moment of tension, feeling a moment of disorientation is a failure of some kind, is a red flag, a stoplight. It's like a stop. A stop sign is really like the best thing I could compare it to, when really it should be a prompt to continue to lean in and be curious. But that would be a new story I think we need to work on telling ourselves and others.
It's very interesting. And I think that's also beneficial for the neurodivergent community.
Yeah.
Because there are many moments throughout the day where you feel that way. You can't make sense in the moment of what's happening. Mm-hmm. But if we welcome this new perspective and an invitation to create a news story about it, it's much more effective. I think it leads
Yeah.
to more effective communication and a better social world. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you for leading us right into it so easily. I wasn't even planning on sharing that, but it just felt like it matched so well with what we're talking about. And thank you for using that language of better social worlds, because I do want to transition us into wrapping up this conversation and use that language of better social worlds. I think that's something that I really hold on to from CMM. That language feels very hopeful to me, and that prompts curiosity in me. I always want to know how people are conceptualizing their better social worlds. And I can see that both of you are very passionate about this work and interested and excited by it. And so I don't feel like I have to ask, is your work a part of making better social worlds? I feel like I can make the assumption that you believe it is. And I'd love to ask how. I think maybe we've already answered that in some ways before I've even asked this question today, but I'd just like to give you one chance as we wrap up to, in your own words, say a little more about, I guess what I'm really asking is, why does this work feel important to you? What's the role of this work of continuing to evolve CMM? What's the role of that in creating better social worlds for us?
There's a simple, easy question. Sure, thank you. We've got how much time? No. Long ago, I started with the idea that came from John Dewey when he wrote that communication was the fundamental social process. All the rest of it is subsidiary to that.
Mm-hmm.
So, what kinds of social processes do we want to encourage? And that doesn't mean that everything has to be open and wonderful and smiling all the time, but to look at the consequences of what we do. What kinds of people are we becoming? What kinds of institutions will create, to use a line from old Peter Senge, learning communities? How do we forward that? What makes it, within the kinds of communication in which we're engaged, a situation that encourages us to try something new? As we were talking about it earlier, to see the moment of confusion not as a stop sign, but as a go sign.
Yes.
And to maintain that kind of respect for one another, so that meaning isn't, from back in the starting place of all this, meaning isn't given. It isn't there in the objects. It's in what we make. And we are responsible for that. So I think CMM very much lends itself to a feeling of responsibility. How are we contributing? What possibilities are we opening up? What possibilities are we closing, which can be important too?
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to open up every possibility, because some pretty horrible things can happen. But to see communication in that light. And then, of course, we haven't had time to talk about the intercultural dimension of this, which has aesthetic implications and much more. But at the intercultural side, that opens us up to all kinds of nice differences.
Mm-hmm.
So I think once you know a little bit about this stuff, you wind up with a responsibility.
Yes. And I recognize just how big of a question it is, and some language that a previous conversation partner I've had on the podcast gave me was that the end of this podcast is a comma. It's not a period, and so I appreciate you putting
nice.
this. Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And putting this in perspective. This is part of a larger conversation and larger work that we're all doing. And so I think we can hopefully take the pressure off ourselves to feel like we've got to say the final word on anything right now. So I just want to say that in response to what you shared.
Sure. No pressure to create the final word, but I think real pressure to keep things moving and going.
Yeah, I really appreciate that piece about responsibility. Claire, what would you say?
There's many different answers for how it leads to the creation of a better social world, but CMM invites us to open up new avenues for thinking, and in doing that, we are improving our ability to navigate differences and to appreciate them instead of neglect them, to understand how difference helps us to function in society. And when we apply certain principles, such as context and reflexivity, to our experiences, we can reflect on our patterns of communication so that we can better understand their influence on the people around us and kind of just take a step back, look at the big picture, look at the small picture, um, and see just being, this leads to being more thoughtful about our actions and what we choose to say, which ultimately I believe leads to the creation of better social worlds. And I know both of you can probably say this in a better way than I can, but I can feel it. Going back to what we discussed at the beginning of the podcast.
Edit that out. It was said very well.
Yeah, I literally was prepping my response to say that was really beautifully said.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's hard to assign the value to this theory that I believe it deserves because it's helped me so much in my everyday life, not just with conflict, but the ability to make new connections. It makes life so much more colorful, at least to me. I have something to look for throughout the day.
Yeah.
It's very enjoyable to me.
That's such a great way to put it. I don't feel like I'm over exaggerating by saying that it's truly like transformative. This is my experience of CMM, and I'm seeing that kind of reflected back from both of you. So I just, again, thank you so much for your time and for this conversation, and happy to end here with a comma with both of you and, keep the conversation going in all the ways that we can. So thank you both again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, that is all for our conversation with Vern and Claire. That wraps up our embodiment series, and it wraps up season 3. But again, we'll be back with season 4 in February of next year. At the end of each episode, I like to offer a question to reflect on, which acts as a next turn for us so the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. Today, the question I would have you think about based on this conversation is, where can you be looking back in order to look forward? Obviously, this question's inspired by the part of the conversation where we focused on reflexivity and also context. At the beginning of this episode, I said I didn't want you to be put off by the kind of technical language. So I'm hoping you're still with us. But reflexivity, if that's not a concept that you're familiar with before now, that's a great vocab word to add into your life and your understanding of CMM. Learning how to be reflexive in our relationships, our conversations, our social worlds. You can reach out to me to share your reflections as well as any of your own questions or ideas. You can do that through email, the website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube, or also by commenting on the CMM Institute Substack under this episode. Links to all those places are in the show notes. The reason I invite you to share your reflection with me is to stay in dialogue. Other great ways to keep dialogue going is to follow the show wherever you listen, leave a rating and review, share this episode, and like I've mentioned in episodes past, there is still time to participate in my season 4 survey. If you would like to share with me what you're getting out of this podcast, what you want to be getting out of this podcast, any ideas you have for the future of this podcast. Much like in this conversation, we've been thinking about the future of CMM and where are we heading. I'm continuing to think about the future of this podcast and what we are creating together. So I hope you'll co-create with me and participate in that. Appreciate anything you want to share. I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to create space for conversations that move us toward those better social worlds we hope to create. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and our other initiatives at the links in the show notes. Again, I'll take a moment to reference some of those initiatives I've been involved with. First is Cosmo Parenting, our next turn in the Cosmo Activities line of social emotional resources that we have available. That's a podcast that's going to be coming out starting in January 2025. So you can use the link in the show notes below to subscribe to the Substack. If you are someone who's parenting, if you know someone who's parenting, those are going to be really meaningful resources. So share those far and wide if you can. We also always have Cosmopolis 2045 as a valuable resource for us to be conceptualizing what it looks like for us in our communities and our societies to embrace a communication perspective and the real change that can come of that. And that Cosmo Activities website that I already kind of referenced a moment ago. All of those resources are available for free, and links to everything found in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abby, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.